Hey guys, what's up? Ross Tone. Tell me something. Did that seem like a toxic masculine act to you? I don't know. A new article, or I say new, it was released maybe a week or more ago on Mick.com by Jack Smith the Fourth. Pretentiousness aside, what the fuck? States that, vaping could be one of the greatest developments that we've ever come up with in terms of fighting the tobacco problem. And yet toxic masculinity is getting in its way. Before I continue, I've got to admit a little bit of bias here. I vape. I know a lot of people who vape. I know a lot of people in the industry who vape. And if I'm ever going to advocate for it, I want to make sure that people know that I have connections to people in vaping. And if we've known anything recently, it's that if you have connections to things, you should probably let people know about it first, or else, shit hits the fan. But there's this interesting article. I mean, I'm not going to pick out bullet points on it, but the whole overarching theme is that if vaping is unsuccessful or if vaping is unattractive, it's because its current market figureheads are appealing very specifically to male audiences. Now, I've attended vaping conventions before, and I know quite a few people, as I said, in the industry, and whilst I agree with that sentiment, maybe 10%, I massively disagree with it overall. The simple reality is that more often than not, whenever you have something that can be geeked out on as much as vaping can be, and trust me, it goes from being something a little more simple than just standard vape pens. I mean, it can get pretty complicated. But when you have something with that sort of massive stretch of like geeky involvement, almost all of the time the spearhead individuals in that sort of geeky involvement, it's going to be men. That doesn't mean that it should be exclusionary or that it's a failure of women or a failure of men. It just tends to be a thing. Now, might be able to trace that back to the simple fact that when you talk about geekiness, you're talking about technology. You're talking about STEM issues and STEM subjects. And whether or not you want to get into a discussion about women's participation in those sorts of fields is lesser because of toxic masculinity, etc., I think that's a different conversation to have. But what we're trying to do here is extend this definition to vaping. Statistically speaking, women are more likely to try and vape than men. Men are more likely to see vaping as a non-masculine act, ironically. Obviously, there's been a lot of sort of dodgy news around the subject. Last year was a bad year for vaping. I mean, it got very popular very quickly, and not a lot of research had been done. So very quickly, a lot of sort of news media, irresponsibly, in my opinion, came along and just started, talking shit about it with very little information in their own hands. And admittedly, vapers themselves haven't had a vast amount of information to call from either. But even the earlier studies stated that quite simply it was probably at least 90 to 95% safer than traditional conventional analog cigarettes. That research has been backed up very recently with the NHS in the UK fully endorsing electronic cigarettes as an alternative means of nicotine cessation. So, I mean, it's the safer route for smoking. It's just safer than smoking. And I think because it's safer, it's weaker. I mean, we do have this sort of culture of, if you really want to talk about, in my opinion, sort of toxic masculinity, then people's unwillingness to adopt electronic cigarettes is toxic masculinity. I don't think the industry itself is laden with it. Vaping is a very apolitical issue. It can bring up single issue voters, and I say apolitical in the sense that it doesn't extend to the sorts of realms of social politics that the internet seems to really be desperate to attach everything to right now. Vaping certainly has its own political movement, but it's completely independent of anything else. Vaping right now in its higher echelons definitely appeals to more geeky people. And that's probably why you're seeing it being adopted by more men than women in the high end. That being said, I do have to wager a criticism or two against vaping accessory and e-liquid producers, because they are marketing in a way that may not necessarily be appealing to women. Booth babes, which are really kind of tacky in my opinion, are actually not particularly uncommon sights at vaping expos. And not only that, but certain companies are also under the impression that because they can retail nicotine vaporizers, they can also retail marijuana vaporizers. They're two very different things. When people say vape, there's a good chance that if you're involved in a community of people who smoke marijuana, they're going to get confused and go, which kind of vape are you talking about? Are you talking about a nicotine vaporizer or a marijuana vaporizer? For this conversation, obviously, we're talking about nicotine vaporizers. But I'm not going to say that electronic cigarette makers and e-liquid distributors aren't a little bit guilty of this potential stereotype, because they're not helping. But I would definitely argue with the idea that vaping is overall dominated by toxic masculinity. I understand the theory of toxic masculinity, and I'm seeing it inserted in places where it really doesn't make any sense. Because toxic masculinity, if you really want to talk about it right now, is pushing people away from vaping, especially men. Statistically speaking, I think I may have mentioned it earlier, is that women are much more likely to actually try electronic cigarettes. And whether or not women want to get involved in the upper echelons of the electronic cigarette sort of geekdom, that's really up to them. In the same regard that even though certain fields, certain aspects of geeky things may be dominated in the higher tiers by more men, how do you then turn market that to women? In fact, how do you make it more agreeable to women without acknowledging gender culture? And if you then acknowledge the gender culture by marketing it to women, when does it become sexist? How do you want it marketed to women? Do you understand? Like, if you start using specific colors or specific narratives to try and market these things to women, at what point does that also then become sexist? I don't know. But what I do know is that I don't feel that vaping and its upper echelons are riddled with toxic masculinities or toxic masculinity. People's perceptions of vapors, that they're fedora-wearing neckbeards, that's entirely a societal thing. I don't believe that vapors bear the responsibility for that. Vaping looks weird. It looks odd, especially if you're using a device like this. If you're using a small vape pen, sure. But if you're using a more advanced device, as I said, much like this, I can understand how it would be considered socially strange and therefore subject to ridicule. It's just a reality. So when realistically vaping's biggest opponent is toxic masculinity, it seems somewhat audacious to assume that vaping isn't being picked up because toxic masculinity is dominating it internally as well. Anyway, I'm Ross Dunn. Like, comment, subscribe.